Hello, and thank you for joining us tonight for Unfolding Futures, a conversation with Karen Lord and Ken Liu, moderated by Amy Brady. My name is Anna Konvicka, and I'm a member of the Cooper Climate Coalition and a junior electrical engineering student at Cooper Union. Thank you for joining us for the Cooper Union Climate Week 2021, a series of lectures and events that aim to engage our community in assessing the role of the climate crisis in our day-to-day lives. This year, we focus on the themes of deconstruction and reconstruction as we imagine all the work ahead of us. The Cooper Climate Coalition aims to promote curiosity, interdisciplinary dialogue, and sustained engagement with the climate crisis. Tonight, it is my pleasure to introduce Ken Liu, Karen Lord, and Amy Brady in a conversation about the roles of decolonization and the climate crisis in science fictional imaginings of future worlds. Ken Liu is an American author of speculative fiction. He has won the Nebula, Hugo, and World Fantasy Awards. His debut novel, The Grace of Kings, is the first volume in a silk punk epic fantasy series, The Dandelion Dynasty, in which engineers play the roles of wizards. His debut collection, The Paper Menagerie and Other Stories, has been published in more than a dozen languages. A second collection, The Hidden Girl and Other Stories, followed. Prior to becoming a full-time writer, Liu worked as a software engineer, corporate lawyer, and litigation consultant. He frequently speaks at conferences and universities on a variety of topics, including futurism, cryptocurrency, the history of technology, bookmaking, narrative futures, and the mathematics of origami. Liu lives with his family near Boston, Massachusetts. It is also my pleasure to introduce Dr. Karen Lord, a Barbadian author, editor, and research consultant. She has been a physics teacher, a diplomat, a part-time soldier, and an academic at various times and in various countries. Her debut novel, Redemption in Indigo, won numerous awards. She published her second novel, The Best of All Possible Worlds, in 2009, and its sequel, The Galaxy Game, in 2015. She is the editor of the 2016 anthology New Worlds, Old Ways, Speculative Tales from the Caribbean. Her most recent novel, Unraveling, was published in June 2019. And finally, our conversation will be moderated tonight by Dr. Amy Brady, the executive director of Orion. Prior to joining the magazine, she served as the deputy publisher of Guernica. She is also the author of Ice, An American Obsession, co-editor of The World as We Knew It, and the former editor-in-chief of the Chicago Review of Books. She holds a PhD in literature from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and her writing on culture and climate change has appeared in O, the Oprah magazine, The New Republic, The Village Voice, Slate, The Houston Chronicle, and other places. Thank you all for being here. I will now hand it over to Amy to begin our discussion.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Cooper Union, for hosting this conversation today. It is such a pleasure and an honor, really, to be here to chat with two phenomenal writers, Karen Lord and Ken Liu. In preparing for this conversation, I was thinking about contemporary writing in general and how, despite the fact that the climate crisis is creeping into all of our lives in so many ways, just how few writers, though there are many more than before, there are still kind of a dearth of writers who are addressing the climate crisis. And so I thought, just to get us started, I would love to hear from both of you what draws you to the climate crisis as writers and why you choose to address it in your work. Karen, could we start with you?
Well, thank you so much for that question, because it allows me to give the context of where I live. I'm sitting right here in Barbados, where I live, and climate change has been a concern of ours for a very long time, since the 80s and 90s. We have tried to advocate on behalf of small island states who will be very much disadvantaged by rising ocean levels. And we've been very concerned about things like the plastics in the ocean and various other things that will affect us in a very direct way. So I think I'm one of those writers who always had those topics in mind whenever I was writing something for the near future world, because it's just very much been part of the background of the country that I live in.
Thank you for that.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you, Karen. For me, I think it's actually, you asked a great question, and it's actually incredibly hard for me to answer, because I think very hard about why I tell the stories that I do. And there isn't always a very obvious answer. Sometimes I feel writers are like fish. If you ask a fish, why does it swim? It's actually not a question that can be answered. I feel sometimes with me and writing, it feels like that. I guess if I have to actually pin it down, I would say the reason I'm so drawn to climate change as a topic, as a thing around which we think about storytelling, it's because climate change for me represents one of the greatest opportunities as well as crises of justice, global justice over time and space. We're talking about climate change as a way in which we play through what duties do the descendants of those who colonized owe to those who were colonized, and what exactly is the way by which we figure out multiple narratives of the future instead of one dominating vision. I don't think you can talk about climate change unless you talk about futurism in general, because the two are so inextricably linked. You cannot imagine a future without accounting for this and accounting for who gets to decide what a just future is. And for me, that's a core concern of mine, both as a lawyer and as a storyteller. So I really can't get around it without addressing climate change, which is so critical to every single issue of justice we have to think about.
Great. Thank you, Ken. That really helps to set the stage, so to speak, I think, for this conversation tonight. The title of this conversation has the word colonized or decolonized in it. We are also speaking today virtually at the Cooper Union, which of course is a school that specializes in engineering and architecture. And in thinking about what I wanted to talk to you both about tonight, I was thinking about how colonization manifests itself in architecture and in engineering in ways that often I think people would find surprising or may not even notice it until they're really looking for it. And so with that in mind, Karen, I was hoping we could start tonight talking to you about your short story Haven, which I think I told you right before this event started that I just was blown away by it. It's such an incredible story.
Thank you.
And yeah, of course. And so for folks who haven't had the pleasure of reading it yet, it is a work of, should we call it speculative fiction? Yeah, it's set in the near future in the Caribbean. And in it, Karen describes these floating cities that are engineered to survive even the strongest of hurricanes. And they incorporate architecture that resembles the 19th century chattel houses, which I believe originated in Barbados. And so, Karen, can you talk to us a little bit about what inspired you to write about this specific kind of architecture, especially in a story about climate change?
Well, the underlying similarity is that the origins of the chattel house and the pressures of climate change are both rooted in you're not necessarily going to be able to settle in one place. You're going to have to keep moving. You're going to have to adapt to the environment. You're going to have to go where the work is. And a lot of our history has been about either being taken where the work is or having to go where the work is. So to give the background to the chattel house, the concept of chattel house is these are quite lovely wooden houses, very specific to Barbados, that once upon a time, not so much now, they're more permanent these days. You could literally take them apart and load them on the back of a truck, move them to another place and set them back up again. So that was in a reaction to the fact that you didn't own the land when people were emancipated, when they from enslavement. The plantocracy still owned the land and were renting it to them as tenants. But if at any point they decided, well, I need to use this land for something else, or I don't want you here anymore, they would just say, right, you have to pack up and leave. So if you'd made the mistake of building a permanent structure, well, that's it. You have to walk away from it. So, taking that concept and saying, we have a region of disasters. We're facing I mean, you mentioned hurricane, but we also have earthquake, we have drought, we have various things. And there's a feeling sometimes that as sort of borders tighten, it's no longer as easy to, go to Panama or go to Cuba or go to the US or so forth. So you begin to start thinking, where can I move about, and what can I do to make it easier to go from place to place? I have to say to people, Barbados is an island that is sufficiently far from the next bit of land that you can't see anything on the horizon. You have to, I think it's basically St. Vincent is our closest neighbor, about 100 miles off. You cannot see any land on the horizon. So it wasn't just building floating cities, it was also making those cities become bridges, so that you then had this ease of motion throughout the region, and this kind of almost as if you were making yourself into a continent. Because that's another one of my underlying anxieties, the feeling that, an island is too small, it's too precarious, but, make yourself connected, make yourself a continent. And then you begin to feel not as if you are settled, but at least as if you have a place to go. If disaster strikes one area, it's easier to shift to another area.
Great. Thank you for that background, Karen. It's just so fascinating to me to think about a kind of engineered architecture that was built to serve people who, because of so many systemic reasons, were kind of forced into a kind of migrancy. But seeing that as a solution of sorts to, in ensuring safe-ish housing during the climate crisis. It's almost like a reimagining of a type of architecture for another purpose.
Well, I've been looking at the whole tiny house movement with great interest because some of them are definitely built on that mobile kind of idea, where either it's, again, you can pick it down and put it back up where you want it, or hitch it to something and drag it somewhere. So I think a lot of people are indeed considering, if I had to even move to another country, could I ship my actual house with me? So probably it's an idea whose time has come in a larger way. I kind of hope so.
I kind of hope so too. Your story inspired so many ideas and thoughts. I am not an engineer by any stretch of the imagination, but I hope some engineers read that story. Engineers watching tonight, read Haven by Karen Lord. It'll inspire you too. Ken, in your writing, technology and different types of engineering also play such a powerful and important role. I'm thinking now of your story, 7 Birthdays, a short story that takes us through time from the near future to more than 800,000 years into the future. And throughout that time, technology is thought of by many members of the human race as a kind of savior. And indeed, it does save the lives and the ways of life of some, but not of others. Do you think that this depiction reflects how we think about technology today, especially as it relates to the climate crisis?
Yeah, thank you, Amy. That's a great question. One of my recurring themes is the way we think about technology is far too narrow, and we really need a much broader way of thinking about what technology is. So let me try to get into this a little bit. Technology, when we talk about it, we think of it as intimately, inextricably, really associated with modernity. Modernity equals high technology. It means rocket ships, it means computer chips, it means electricity, it means all of those things. I think that's a very narrow-minded and incredibly misleading way to think about technology. I think of technology really in terms of its Greek roots, of the word. It's a discourse about knowing, of skill. So it really, I think of technology as any kind of manifestation of the human mind in the physical world in some way. It can be language, it can be social organization, it can be forms of government. So juries are technology, so are councils, collective councils making decisions, so are surveys, so are stories. These are all actually technologies because they shape the way we tell the story of who we are, and they shape the way we put our minds into the world. That's sort of what we do. In the same way that beavers build dams and bees make honeycombs, we make technology. So everything we do that is not that's not just growing as a human being. Those things, anything we make is technology. And I think when you think about technology in that broad sort of way, as a way for us to manifest who we are, as a way to tell the story of who we are, you begin to see very different visions for how technology can be interesting and useful for the way we interact with the world. So I'll give you a very concrete example. What Karen was telling me, talking about in terms of housing and the way people build houses in reaction to their environment is very, very important to me. One of the things that I think has been a great failing of modernity is because we have this narrative of technology, high technology equals modernity. That story has led to countless tragedies. So I'm thinking of large swath of Asia, where traditional architecture has been, the vernacular architecture has been entirely abandoned in favor of imitation of Western models. So instead of building with natively available materials with thousands of years of history, because that kind of native craft is not seen as engineering. Many societies have abandoned vernacular architecture in favor of glass, concrete, steel construction imported from the West. The result of that is incredible environmental damage. These buildings are not, just modern architecture is one of the greatest sins committed by the human race. My college had this wonderful modern glass and steel science center, and you know what's amazing about it? They build it in such a way, it's in Boston, so it's very cold and it gets snowy. So every winter they have to drag out these huge plastic buckets under the glass roof because it leaks. The entire thing leaks. It leaks water. It's sort of like in Seattle, they have to actually hire people to go up there to shovel the snow off of the Space Needle because it's dangerous. They designed this thing without thinking about it. But modern architecture is all like that, all over the place. In parts of Asia, traditional architecture was very earthquake resistant and very resilient. But once they build with concrete, these houses become death houses in an earthquake. And now we have to go back and re-engineer these buildings with spending billions of dollars trying to put more high technology into technology, trying to fix these problems that would have been fixed had people just kept on building the way they had been building for thousands of years. We need to change the way we think about technology as somehow imitating the US and Europe somehow equals modernity. We need to get away from the idea that because the colonizer were able to conquer those places, everything they do must therefore be right. This is the ancient, might equals right logic that we seem to be unable to get away from. But it's a matter of storytelling. The only reason we feel this way is because that is the story of modernity. We have learned to identify this style of architecture as global modernity. We have learned to identify this way of building cities that depend on cars as global modernity. We have learned to identify a lifestyle in which people spread into the suburbs, and we worship the idea of the freedom of the highway. Hollywood, tells these stories, and they become the vision to aspire to around the globe. And to say that that we can somehow fix climate change and really confront the crisis without changing fundamentally the stories we tell about what a desirable life is fantasy. We cannot value this vision and then expect to solve problems.
Can I just jump in because
Please.
Ken as usual is saying stuff that is making me chuckle, because what you're describing in a way is the way in which colonizer or even the kind of quasi-colonizer tends to impose their values or impose their view of of what is civilized, what is forward. And I was just going to say, one of the very first plantation houses in Barbados has chimneys. They didn't make that mistake again. But you see, that was the standard. Yeah, at first it had chimneys. But, they learned. And then basically when you begin to look at some of the architecture, there's a lot of marvelous like passive cooling. And, they're kind of understanding that you got hurricanes, we got a lot of heat, you got to take advantage of the trade winds coming in from the east and all sort of thing. And then, of course, we did indeed go through this suburbia love, as you say, especially around the 60s and 70s, where people, I think, were building their houses in ways that were forgetting a lot of those lessons learned. And now we have a return, shall we say, to some of the aspects of the colonial architecture, where again, look at your passive cooling, look at, even just what you paint your roof and so forth. So all of that is sort of like coming back around again. So, and to kind of put my finger exactly on that, when you say we're looking at technology as not really a thing that works, but just a thing that looks like it's modern, to me, that is when you are prioritizing form over function. And I do think that for me, the perfect architecture, the perfect engineer, the perfect technology, form is function. You've really managed to like marry the two together in a way that they enhance each other and complement each other. And of course, depending on your environment and your setting, it's going to be different. It's going to be a little change for every place, because we're all facing different challenges, different crises or whatever. So I think that the example of how we've all kind of found ourselves into this idea of the modern city is actually a really good image to look at. How we do need to just change how we look at technology and change how we look at what the future should look like. I assure you that when I write the future, it's not all cities of glass and metal. I can't do that.
Karen, what you said also really just reminded me of something that I wanted to bring up too. You mentioned form over function is a great error that we make in modernity. I think sometimes we don't even know that we're doing that, because we have mistaken functions of bureaucracy and functions that serve the story we want to tell as the same as functions we actually want to serve to make people happy and to make people live fulfilled lives. So I'll give you an example. I did spend many years working in the legal industry, and so I have some experience with the construction industry. And you would think that construction is about building buildings that people actually want. It's not. It's actually not. Sometimes the fantasies we spin become more important than the actual things we were trying to build. So for example, there's a huge movement to build green buildings, so-called green buildings. So you would think, again, whether a building is green ought to be easy to measure. It's about, do you use locally sourced materials? Do you use materials that are renewable? Do you build things that are energy efficient because it uses passive cooling and passive heating, and does not try to create these ludicrous modernist bubbles that no one really wants to live in? That's actually not how it works, because the way whether something is green isn't defined by these amorphous ideas. It's defined by very meticulously engineered legal codes that define specifically what green actually means. And once you've gotten the bureaucracy involved, then you start to play optimization games. And when you measure something, the thing that you measure becomes much more important than what you were actually trying to do, because the measurements are merely proxies for what you're trying to accomplish. But that tends to get lost over time. So a lot of times the definition for what is green is actually carefully sculpted by lobbyists for various industries to shape what is considered green. They define green in such a way so that the material they produce will be considered green, but not of those competitors. They do it in such a way that the way they build would be considered green, but not anybody else. it's all about that. Law is part of engineering, it's part of technology, and legal technology often becomes far more influential than any other kind of technology in terms of how modern Western societies function. We talk about the rule of law as being, very important, but one of the downsides of the rule of law is the bureaucratic state in which regulations, bureaucracies, and definitions and numbers that are engineered by those with access to power and those who are in the industry who know how to manipulate things to be exactly the way they want. They shape these laws to generate the tax credits for their projects. So it ends up becoming not really serving green unless you consider dollars to be the green you're trying to serve. So
in this, okay, sorry, I'm going to get a little heated here. Why is it that the lust for short-term gain is so often leading to long-term incompetence? Because you're talking about people basically setting things up so that they can, make a certain amount of money for their company or whatever in their lifetime, roughly, or at least in their working lifetime, not even necessarily in their lifetime. We keep talking about climate change and what it means for, the next generation, children, the grandchildren, and so forth. There is none of that thinking there. I mean, did we not once have a time where if you built a cathedral, it was understood that you were not going to build this in one person's lifetime? You actually had a generational project happening where, you were thinking, 300 years from now, they're going to see this completed. Is there any project that we have on right now that has that kind of mentality, that kind of, we are building this and the children will continue it and the grandchildren will continue it and the great grandchildren will finally benefit? I don't know if we have that anymore.
Karen, I agree with you. I don't think we do. I think that is really one of those fascinating turns in modernity that we have to trace back to see how it happened. I feel that what we have now is this collective narrative that it's okay to be selfish and it's okay to be short-term minded, because the idea is that magically the market will take all of our selfish impulses and turn it into a public good. Somehow magically late capitalism will turn our short-sighted immediate concerns and lead to lasting benefit. I think we have a narrative that somehow magically, if we just serve the rule of efficiency, we just make things efficient, we will have growth, and growth will magically solve all problems in the future. I mean, if you talk to Silicon Valley folks, that is their idea. That appears to be. I don't think they are, in fact. So I think they're actually quite idealistic. They really believe that if everyone just focused on getting efficient and to let's build more Ubers, let's get more cars on the roads, and let's make them be used 100% of the time. Somehow magically, this will just lead to better futures. If we built faster computers, better networks, just make everything grow. Somehow magically solution will come. We'll get to Mars. We'll get to colonize the universe, I guess, somehow. I don't really know if this is a matter of self-delusion or something deeper. But I do think we have this idea that somehow by being short-sighted and by being concerned with just the here and now, it will all work out magically.
It's a very sorry.
Oh no, that's okay, Karen. I actually just wanted to just pause for just a moment and tell the folks who are watching tonight that we are going to answer some of their questions as well. So if they haven't done so already, to be sure to put some of their questions into the chat, and in a few more minutes we will get to those. I just didn't want to lose sight of that. The other thing I just wanted to say, because the two of you have so many amazing ideas that you're throwing out there, and I get the feeling there are a couple of threads that I think folks would really like to hear you both tease out a little bit more. And one of those is this idea of the role that storytelling plays. We keep kind of circling back around this. And if I can just say for just a moment, as somebody who has read a lot of science fiction, a lot of speculative fiction, a lot of what some folks are now calling climate fiction, that technology, engineering all plays a role in it. And that largely, and there are so many different reasons for this, everything from publishing industry trends and beyond. There's so many reasons. So many of these stories are actually set in the West. Many of them are set specifically in the United States. And many of them are set in these glass and concrete cities that both of you are describing as being detrimental once they're adopted by other people in other regions and other communities. So I suppose my question for you both then is, what types of stories, well, first off, whose voices are not being heard in these stories about the climate crisis? And how might maybe some of the young writers who are watching you both tonight, what would you suggest that they think about when they are trying to give shape to the climate crisis through narrative? What are some new types of narrative techniques or ideas that they should consider?
Ken, she wants to get us in trouble now, doesn't she?
I know.
Not in trouble, inspiring.
Well, can I start by saying something related to the answer? This is something that's sort of a pet peeve of mine. I think a lot of times I've served as a judge for some fiction contests related to climate change, and I see a trend that I think is worth bringing up. Because a lot of the writers who participate in these contests come from the quote unquote the first world. And I think their intentions are very good, but they sometimes don't really see the blindness of what their own narratives, because we get trapped in the stories that we tell, right? So, I've been fortunate to travel quite a bit around the world and talk to people in different parts of the globe and hear their own take on climate change and how it impacts their lives and what they think is a just vision and how they think they can solve the problem. What I can say is, universally, this is true. Every single other country that I've been to, the people tell the story with themselves as agents of change. They have agency. They are the ones there to build the future. They're not expecting somebody else to solve the problem for them. They are there to say, this is what we can do. This is how we can make things better. What I tend to see, though, from a lot of writers in the West is this idea that somehow the West need to save the world, that somehow the world needs to be saved by them, that they are the ones who will magically helicopter in. I often see the story of this super smart college kid from the US who travels to Malaysia and sees how the indigenous people built something. And she says, oh, I'm inspired. I'm going to take this idea and give it a scientific backgrounding and figure out that this is actually really scientifically sound. This is a great idea. I'm going to make this into a thing that everybody else will adopt. But it's because she had the insight as a Westerner to come in to see that this is a thing that the natives have been doing that they didn't even know that it was so great, and it took her to figure it out. Or it's something like I am, or the story is there's a refugee person. This is very common. There's a person who is a refugee who goes to the West, who goes through Western colleges and universities and gets a great degree and goes back, quote unquote, to her people to solve their problems, now armed with Western science and technology. If these are the kind of narratives we repeatedly tell, we will never actually see other voices and other stories. This is just a very well-intentioned, updated version of the white savior story. It's deeply colonialist and frankly, not very interesting or realistic. That's just not how things are going to work. So I would like to see people push harder and not fall into those traps. I know those kind of narratives are very easy because they are the pattern for so much of what we do in Hollywood and in popular literature, but it's just silly. These are not interesting stories.
They're not interesting stories specifically because they're so simplistic. It's always a magic bullet kind of solution. It's always a here it is and now we're finished. I am actually finding a lot of I don't know if joy is the word, shall we say comfort in various stories, either in text or on screen, that have a more muted ending, an ending that basically says we made a little bit of progress. Other people will come alongside us or after us and continue the fight. and the whole point is to continue the fight. That is actually something I find more reassuring, more realistic, and ultimately more of a good lesson for me to carry into my life. I know sometimes fiction is escapism, and fine, sometimes we do want a big superhero to come in and save the day. But in terms of just sort of, as you say, repeated narratives that kind of get into your bones and make you think this is what life could be like, I want more of the stories that are about the collective, about the long game, about the continuing to fight, about the continuing vigilance. These are the stories that we need. And I also want to say that in any emerging writer, I'm not going to say young writer, you can be a writer at any age, any emerging writer who is pondering what kinds of stories they should be writing, don't put all that pressure on yourself. Just look around at the world and it will come to you. I want to put the pressure on the industries that do not recognize what great stories are already out there that are not being given the audience and the readership that they should be given. Because there are already some emerging writers out there that are doing some things I'm really excited about. And my major concern is not how to inspire them, it's how to keep them going. It's how to find a market for them. It's how to find a place that will publish them and will pay them well and will appreciate what they're doing, because they're not always looking for the same thing. So I'm going to flip that back. I'm going to say, emerging writers, keep your eyes and ears open. Look at all the stories and the lessons all around the world. Always put yourself literally in other people's shoes or behind other people's eyes, I like to put it, because you are not always the one swooping in. Sometimes you have to be thinking, what is it like if I'm the person here? Some people do that with alien narratives, do a first contact, but we're the savages and the aliens are the highly advanced people, and what does that feel like? Well, yeah, fine, but we don't even have to go that far. Just think to yourself, have a look at, we have so many opportunities now to see other people's stories. Netflix alone will take you all around the world in terms of the stories that people are telling. There's no excuse to only have a single story now. There's no excuse to have just one narrative. I just want to say one other thing in terms of the power of storytelling. And it was something that Ken said a lot earlier when he was talking about the Silicon Valley mentality of, we're just going to do this thing and we're going to do it really well and we're going to make more of it and somehow it'll all sort out. Stories, I hope, help people understand that even though they can be brilliant in their one area, it doesn't mean that they can't be stupid in other areas. Mm-hmm. And I think a well-told story will show you how things connect, and will show you just how much nuance and expertise is required for these other areas that you may never have heard about. I am always, let me tell you, if a story can send me to do research, if a story can make me go, oh, I didn't know that, and I am just like going to read all the primary research and all the articles and all the rest of it, to me, the story is a win, okay? I don't need a hero. I need something that just makes me think, wow, I never saw it that way. I never realized this was a factor, et cetera, et cetera. And then boom, you're going and you're teaching yourself. It's not that the story is that you're learning from the story. The story is inspiring you to go and find out. That is what I hope a story can do. A good story can do when it's looking at, our present problems, our future hopes, whatever.
Karen, to follow up on what you just said, I also want to two things. One is I want to tell emerging writers that they have to try very hard, and I think this actually will work out for them in the long term, not to imitate the stories that are already there, but to tell their own things. That's probably, if there's any bit of advice that I think actually is worth giving, that's probably the advice that I care about the most. Do not imitate the stories that are already there. The way you will be satisfied with yourselves to tell your own stories. That is the only thing that will make you happy. The other thing I wanted to point out is the idea of sustainability, which is in contrast to the very short-sighted late capitalist obsession with efficiency. Sustainable things take a long time and they last a long time. And like Karen said, they Look, I believe that a sustainable solution to climate change is not going to be implemented in one generation. It will take many generations of work. We did not get here in one generation. We're not going to get out of there in one generation either. So anytime people have this idea that somehow we will magically solve the problem with a technocratic, snap of the finger, that's just not how it is. Solving the climate change crisis actually is our cathedral. It will take us many generations to do. It's our interstellar spaceship. It will take generations to carry on this mission.
Look at the quotable quotes you're giving me.
To see the results.
This is being recorded.
So if you can turn that epic journey that the human race is engaged in into a story, that would be a worthwhile endeavor. And I really haven't seen a lot of people go for that. And finally, this is also really important to me. Storytelling to me is key because it reminds us that ultimately, we humans are creatures of emotion, not creatures of rationality. I often think that rationality is this thing that we're supposed to worship as part of modernity. Again, what is modern is often identified as what is rational. Somehow, if you have data, it magically justifies anything that you do. Well, the problem is this. Even this idea where you're worshiping the rational and you're trusting your decisions to data, that itself is an emotional decision. That itself is a commitment to a particular way of prizing certain emotions over others. It's not that Spock had no emotions. It's just that you're worshiping Spock's emotion as the one emotion above all others. So the idea that somehow commitment to rationality means that you have to devalue emotional responses is silly. It's ultimately very dehumanizing to think that somehow that's going to get you where you need to go. Stories remind us that our values, our ultimate commitments to values are emotional. So I'll give you an example, right? I have seen an article in a fairly prominent newspaper that claims that the problem with Texas's law against abortion is that it will have economic consequences. It will somehow damage the economy of Texas. So here's my point. My point is that your decision on issues like the right to abortion or the right to healthcare or whether we should have nuclear weapons, whether countries should prepare for nuclear warfare. These are deeply emotional decisions. Your commitment to these values have to be based on actual emotions. If your decision is based on the idea that somehow killing 6 people is economically better than killing 10 people or whatever it is that your math is, I don't think we trust you. But those are not decisions that we want to trust. The most important decisions cannot be trusted to rationalizations. That's why it's important to tell stories, because stories are the way we encode our most sacred values, which are always emotional commitments.
Yes.
Beautifully put, Ken. Thank you. Well, speaking of stories and how they reflect our values and our interests and where we put our foci. Karen, I want to come back to you for a second when you were saying to emerging writers, to draw on stories from around the world. And I was thinking about how you set Haven in the Caribbean, and Ken, I'm thinking about how the Dandelion Dynasty draws on Asian history to tell this epic fantasy, which is such in stark contrast to so many other epic fantasies that are published, at least in the United States. I'm also thinking about Amitav Ghosh's recent novel Gun Island, which features a protagonist who travels to Bangladesh and realizes that he needs to draw on Bengali myth to better understand the consequences of climate change in the contemporary world, to help make sense of just how strange things have gotten. And so as storytellers yourselves, I would just love to hear what kinds of settings, or maybe the better question is, what kind of narrative traditions do you both look to craft your own stories? And are there specific traditions that you would encourage emerging writers to also look at or draw from to tell stories about the future?
If I could go first, because I do want to add a little caveat.
Yeah.
So appropriation is a thing. When I encourage people to look at stories from around the world, sometimes people then think that they need to like scoop up a story that they found that was really cool and just like run with it. And they don't have the context, the depth, the historical background to fully understand what the story is doing. And it comes off as a really bad mistake, because it doesn't ring true to the source. It doesn't ring true to your voice, and it becomes a mess. I think ultimately, for better or for worse, as writers, we are always rooted in the tradition that we come from. Some of us come from more than one place, and that's fine. But we're ultimately rooted in the stories that we heard growing up, the voices that we heard, not just the books that are given to us, because again, from a former colony, trust me when I say that's a lot of British Empire stuff anyway. But the stories that you hear verbally being told, the way people gossip, the way people preach, the way people give their political speeches, these are all things that have their own unique flavor and tang, and that's what you will pick up, and that's what will go into your voice as a writer. What I would encourage people to do more of is, when you look at these other stories from other places, you will see what resonates with you as being familiar. And you will also see what is absent that you're like, wait a minute, you don't have to do it like that. But Hollywood always told me you did. Or this particular brand of literature, Western literature always told me you had to have, this 3-act structure or whatever. So it's also to just see what the differences are. And then that allows you to go back and look at your own place, sometimes with fresh eyes, and see the value there, because it's echoed someplace around the world completely. On the other side of the world completely. So let's just be careful with the borrowing. I don't want to make it sound like you're gonna just like scoop up things wholesale and just not give any respect to them and not give any like full thought to them. You have to be very careful with that. You have to be very respectful of that, because we live in a world that colonization is just baked into our historical bones, and the stealing of stories, the warping of stories, the misrepresentation just runs so deep that I cannot blame people when they get upset and see someone making money off of something that is really theirs, or misrepresenting it in a way that brings actual damage to how they live their lives in the present. So, whatever you do, remember your own foundations first and foremost, and then be in conversation with other people's traditions.
Karen, thank you. That was like such an important point. And I would not have been able to make that point as well as you did. That was awesome. I want to follow up on that point, which is for all the writers to think also about how we engage with stories in general, right? So I've had this theory about fiction for a long time, which is that fiction is always a collaborative exercise. There's a storyteller, but also there's a story interpreter. The reader has to make the text come alive and hear the story, make it come alive. And here's where it becomes really interesting, because I think of every story I write as basically a house. I build a house and I leave it empty. And then the reader has to come to it and make sense of it. What the reader does is the reader comes in and unpacks herself and puts her sheets on the bed and leaves her pictures around the house, explores it, colors it, paints it. It's only when the reader has put herself into the text does the text become meaningful for her. When I write the word love, the word is meaningless until the reader has engaged and made that word love come alive through her own stories of childhood, of what love means. The way she was loved is how she will interpret the word love. The way she was hated is the way she will interpret the word hate. The way she was honored is the way she will interpret how honor functions. So in other words, all of us cannot escape bring our own stories into every story we encounter. We always incorporate other people's stories into our own stories. We're always self-centric. So for example, right, I give this talk a lot in which I talk about my grandmother. And it's only recently that I thought deeply about this. And I realized that all the stories I tell my grandmother feature her in relation to me. I have incorporated her into my stories. And when I tell her stories, they're really my stories. I do not tell the stories the way she would have told her own story. And we need to all recognize that when we tell a story, when we engage with the story, we're bringing our own stories into it. It's always egocentric. It's inevitable. It's the way the human mind is. We need to embrace it. Okay, what I mean is when you're engaging with the narrative, you're always engaging with it as an outsider or an insider, or sometimes both. There are narratives that are native to your own tradition that you engage with as an insider. And it's a different experience than when you engage with the story from another narrative tradition as an outsider. I'm not saying one is better than the other. In fact, they're both actually quite relevant, but you have to recognize the position, your own intersubjectivity vis-a-vis the narrative. How you are constructing that story is as much about you as it is about that story. So, in terms of concrete advice, I think we all need to be a little bit more humble about realizing that when we're engaging with narratives from outside our own comfort zone, we're engaging with something that may speak differently to those in the tradition. That it may say something that we don't understand. Not that our own insights as outsiders are somehow not relevant, but we need to recognize that they are just one way of engaging with the story. I'm particularly thinking of how irked I was. I also work as an editor, so I edited these anthologies of science fiction written by Chinese authors, and I remember a recurring theme of white critics, white male critics, who point out that somehow the stories written by the Chinese women authors are somehow not feminist enough for them, which is about as mansplaining and whitesplaining as you can get. But this becomes like, and then I was like, you have no idea what these women are writing about and what they're engaging in and what they're trying to do. You have applied your own vision of what feminism is as a white male, and you've somehow decided that you get to decide what is sufficiently feminist. That kind of error, of course, is more extreme than I think lots of other types of errors. But I think we all commit errors like that. And I just want to say that, in addition to Karen's point about being respectful, we also need to sort of repeatedly acknowledge our own limitations and the way that we don't necessarily understand everything there is to understand. And that should make us humble and make us more aware of just the grandness of the human spirit.
Wonderful. Thank you both. This has been just such a fascinating conversation. I'm learning from both of you. I think so many folks tuning in tonight are also learning from you, so thank you. We have a lot of questions coming in, by the way, from folks who are watching. So if okay with the two of you, let's turn to some of them, because I'm sure you both have some brilliant responses to them. Here is a question from somebody who, this is dovetailing on our earlier question about architecture. And this person asked, what are some artifacts from your individual cultures, careers, or countries that you want to see in future architecture?
So I think that anytime that you're able to use the materials of the place that you're in, that's always a very attractive proposition, because the thing that leapt into my head immediately, although it's not always good for every situation is I love to see the thick cut coral stone being used as a building material. It's not something you can use for everything or for every day, but it's got such a it's so hurricane proof for one thing. It's got such a solidity to it. It's cool. They're so thick that if you go into buildings that basically are constructed, the inside just like drops by like 3 or 4 degrees immediately. And like I said, the glass and the steel, I just see it as being a thing that heats up, and then you need air conditioning. But you walk into, one of the old buildings that is just this really, really thick cut limestone, and you don't even need it, just strategically placed windows and these really, really thick walls, and you're already there. So I think that's kind of what I would like to see, especially for the halls, for things that are for communal use, where you have this massive structure. It can also function as a shelter later on. I just want that to be where the solidity is, which is funny because I've just talked about a lot of like mobile things you can pack up and move, but in the midst of that, in the center of it, let there be something that has that almost rootedness to the earth.
I have something similar in mind, not necessarily a specific suggestion for architecture as much as a way to rethink about the space that we live in. I was recently trying to work with my daughter's social studies, and I was trying to teach them how to read maps. So as part of that, I printed out some maps of our town and had them mark their favorite walking path and favorite playgrounds and stuff like that. And one of the things that really leapt out at me is how much space we devote to cars versus to people. This is a science fictional cliche, but aliens who come to visit Earth may well think that cars are the dominant life form and humans are just parasites, because the amount of space we devote to cars vastly dwarfs the amount of space we devote to people. Every stadium has 100 times more space devoted to parking lots. Every single shopping center is just a little island in the middle of a giant ocean of asphalt. When you look at the picture of a neighborhood, you see how little space humans actually occupy in contrast to cars. How do we get to this place? Why do we think this is somehow normal? It's so much so that this landscape, car-centric landscape, has now shaped every single effort to combat it. I myself, I will just be frank, am not a big believer in electrical vehicles. I do not think that they're particularly green, and I do not think they solve anything, because what are they? They're just a faster kind of car. They are essentially cars. They simply perpetuate the car culture that we already have and push even heavier energy demands. And we, somehow make this sound better by claiming that this will create more green jobs, but we're just increasing our energy needs. This is still about growth. This is still about creating more demand, more growth. It's fundamentally not changing the pattern that we got into. It doesn't solve our obsession with these asphalt roads that need to be resurfaced constantly. It's ridiculous how we ended up with this particular state of affairs when you have Roman roads that have lasted thousands of years just because people keep on walking on it and they're still maintained. But our roads can't even last one winter without having to be resurfaced. It's ridiculous. I would like to see us trying to work much harder at building human-centric urban spaces, not car-centric urban spaces.
Great, thank you. Another attendee brings up the novel by Kim Stanley Robinson, New York 2140, and admires Robinson's novel in terms of its realistic and likely technical adaptations to climate change. And so this person would like to ask both of you, how do you think we'll adapt existing habitats, not build new ones? And can you kind of started to get us there a little bit with your car talk.
Well, if I can just start by talking about something that is very dear to my heart, which is, so I go back to storytelling again, right? And I talk about how habitats and technology are not just high-tech stuff, but also the stories we tell. So I like to think about how can we adapt the stories that we tell ourselves to account for climate change. We're all aware of these terrible fires out in California and other parts of the world, and they are, in my view, the consequence of the American dream meeting the American dream. That's basically it. The reason these things are happening in large part is because people keep on trying to get away from the dense urban centers. They're trying to build into areas of wilderness because this is the American dream. What is the American dream? It's to claim the frontier, to live in a place that's far away from everyone else, to be free, right? But part of that also is when you do that, you end up moving into places that will inevitably put you into conflict with native wildlife, and then require fire management that just forest management that just leads to the potential for even worse fires in the future. As long as we keep on allowing development to happen that way, this is not going to be a solvable problem. This is sort of like all those condos being built in Florida on land that's going to be flooded. You can try to build seawalls until the cows come home, but it's like Pacific Rim, which is a great metaphor for climate change. In Pacific Rim, they try to build these seawalls. They don't work. The kaiju will come through. You cannot build seawalls and save Florida. Your condos are not going to be saved. It's the exact same thing. We need to adapt our narratives about what is a desirable life. What is the American dream? What is the right way to reconfigure freedom and responsibility, so that we don't keep on putting ourselves in positions like this, where we keep on banging our heads over and over against something, and then we ask ourselves, why is this? Why doesn't the universe move? Well, the universe is not going to move. We have to move. That's something that we have to think about. How do we adapt our dreams and stories to fit a realistically sustainable future?
So I'm thinking two things. There's a question of what can we adapt to and what do we have to abandon, because the cost of adaptation is actually going to be far greater than the cost of just trying somewhere different and trying something different. I think we're going to have to be very wise about the choices that we make. There are going to be some areas that are just, as you say, building new condos in Florida is really just not a thing you want to be doing right now. There are going to be some places that they're going to have to say, we, generationally looking down the road, we are not looking to put more development into this place. We are in fact looking to draw people out from this place with, whether it is, availability of jobs or availability of housing or whatever, draw them into a place that's going to be able to handle the crises that are coming. One of the things that I wrote about in a recent manuscript, so it's not published, I can't point you to it, but I look at a not too close future, but a little further, not too far future either. And there are places like New York and Amsterdam that are, as you say, the seawalls are not just getting higher and higher. In fact, New York is almost like a Venice, where it's like they've abandoned the lower levels of the skyscrapers, and it's the city keeps building itself higher and higher on these pontoons and whatever, into connected by the skyscrapers. But parts of the Netherlands are starting to actually completely enclose themselves like undersea environments, and maybe we will see some of that. That would be interesting, but that comes with a cost. That always comes with a cost. So whatever we do, let us be correct about how we do the sums, not just the bottom line in terms of dollars and cents, because as Kenneth pointed out, I think we're a little too obsessed with dollars and cents sometimes. But let us look at the cost also in terms of people's attachment to places, in terms of what it means. I mean, we're going to have a borders conversation very soon. Yep. And all of these things are going to have to be factored in to determine whether you're going to have to say, do we leave this place and go somewhere else? Trust me when I say that this is a conversation that a lot of these low-lying islands are having and have been having for a very long time. You know, is somebody going to give us a piece of land or continent and allow us to call it the new whatever? Or do we have to find a way to build walls around what we have and then maintain them? It becomes a very fraught question. And there are going to be a lot of factors involved. So some adaptation, some new, and sometimes we're not always going to make choices based on what makes sense. Unfortunately, it's going to be a lot of, well, I don't quite want to say competition, but we've already seen in our history, there are going to be some people who think that they have better right to certain resources and certain safety nets than others. And that's what's going to play out. Yeah. And when the first thing you opened with, Ken, was the word justice. And I thought that is a beautiful word to use in this context. Because if you're talking about justice and equity, then the sums become sensible. But when have we ever been sensible about justice and equity? That's our problem right now.
Karen, that is such an important observation, and also a perfect segue into another question that one of our viewers have, which is, what responsibilities do those of us in places with less risk of climate change-based natural disaster have to future climate refugees, beyond the obvious duty to provide refuge in the first place? It's a big question.
I wish we didn't still have an us or them situation when it came to dealing with people who have to flee a particular place because of disaster or because of war. Because I keep feeling like there's always this attitude of, well, you know, we're fortunate, it'll never happen to us, we're better off, so on and so forth. I mean, you don't even have to look beyond the last century to realize that you know, so many refugees came from Europe to the US, for example, you know, and they're going to be, it could be you one day. That's my bottom line. It could be you one day. So when we talk about the responsibilities, I really do want us to have a global sense of what we need to do about the refugee situation and what we need to do about the whole concept of borders. Borders got tightened in large part because of responses to terrorism and so forth. And I am not convinced the tightening the borders has actually made things better in that regard. I think we need to come up with new systems where people can move more freely. So we don't have a refugee. We have someone who is able to immediately find themselves plugged into a system where they can move easily and there's no stigma attached. There's no feeling that you have to be doing them any favors, because it's already just set up that, you know what, here are your qualifications, here's what you can do, here's where the need is, here's your sort of like welcome package, and we set you up somewhere. And it's just the understanding that, you know, these are the times where people become more mobile. I would like us to actually move away from the whole concept of a refugee. I don't know how that happens.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I agree, Karen. I think the entire refugee narrative has been deeply troubling to me. You know, I see it reflected in our political discourse, in our art. And I have to say that one of the dominant narratives, well-intentioned again, but potentially deeply problematic, is this idea that reaching out to refugees is a noble act. And somehow, the problem is this. Whenever something like this is phrased in terms of this is the noble thing to do, there are strings attached. The idea is that somehow refugees need to be grateful, that there are things that they're supposed to do. And I'm very familiar with this because this is a constant part of the narrative of immigration in the US. Many children of immigrants replicate this narrative even unconsciously. They always say, you know, I come from a third world country. My parents came from a third world country, and I'm so grateful, blah, blah, blah. maybe there are reasons to be grateful, maybe there aren't. But when
Mhm.
that narrative becomes the dominant narrative, when all children of immigrants and immigrants themselves are expected to repeat that, or else go back to where you're from, right? When that is the narrative they're expected to parrot, there's something deeply, deeply troubling about the replication of the colonial narrative. Because once again, you're saying there are saviors, civilized people, and there are people who are here who ought to be grateful for the benefits being conferred on them. Karen, I would love to know how we can move the narrative away from the doing them a favor versus being grateful. That cannot be the right narrative. It's going to lead to more and more conflict. It's going to lead to entitlements. It's going to lead to resentment, conflict, and it's going to be generational. Again, Karen, I have to say this is a generational thing. What we have seen over the years of studying refugee communities and refugee descendants of refugees is that this is not something that can be solved in one generation. These issues persist generationally. We have to figure out a way to solve this. And I don't know what the answer is, but well, I don't want to end on a note of despair. I want to end on a note of hope, which is I'm hoping that the emerging writers are the ones who will figure out the stories that will lead us out. You're the ones who will create the narratives that are new, that are not going to be mere replications of the tried and true and the old and tried. You're going to do something new and really inspire all of us to a solution that works.
I'm 100% behind that. I look forward to the decade when people can look back on my work and talk about how cliched and problematic it is, because it will mean that things have really evolved to a certain stage where I can be nice and obsolete, because people are thinking in different ways and have some solutions and have some visions of the future that I couldn't even begin to grasp. So yes, that's our generational project. That's what literature is.
I'm being told here we have time for one more question from an attendee. And the question is, what's something that's being done outside of Western Europe and North America right now to help push back climate change that could be adopted, but isn't being adopted because of its country of origin?
I don't have that specialized knowledge. I don't. I mean, I did, in fact, used to work in the Foreign Service, and I could argue that there are plenty of things that lots of smaller countries are doing that don't seem to hit the news. And some of it is like what Ken calls technology, where it's more looking at the systems and different things can be done and different organizations be created to move things along. But then there's probably various technological things as well that I'm just completely not aware of because it was never my area of expertise and so forth. And we also have to appreciate that not being in the news doesn't always mean that something isn't being taken up. I am sometimes heartened by the extent to which certain specialists do in fact work very globally. And in even countries that you don't think would have partnerships in particular areas, when you actually dig down into the research, it's like, oh, they've actually been working at this for a while. Tiny example, I was reading articles, I was hearing about collaboration between Argentinian and Falkland Islander scientists, where when they began to have their conflict, the biggest thing was, oh my goodness, now we're going to find it hard to collaborate, because the science was what was about, I think it was geographers working in the same region, or maybe it was oceanographers, dealing with the sea between them or something like that. And it was very much about, it's the data, we want to share the data, we want to do this stuff. And the whole question of the politics and the boundaries and whatever. And of course, a lot of this was not in the news until later when people were looking for their feel-good stories. And if there hadn't been a war, people might not have even been aware that scientists were working that way. So, a lot of there is I think some good stuff that happens. It's not heralded, and we need to. This is why I say we need to always look at it as a long game. We always need to look at it as something that we are, we do our little bit, and somebody else is going to come and do a little bit more, and not look for it to be something massive that's talked about in a big newspaper, because I actually don't trust those as well. Sometimes you got to come back 3 years later and see, well, that thing that they were heralding, did anything ever happen with that? No, okay, it was, I guess, sexy for a while, good. So yeah.
Karen, your point about not trusting what's, the examples being held up, I so identify it. I'm so glad you said that, because being a storyteller has made me more skeptical of stories than ever. It's just something that you end up professionally become very aware of. The reason I don't want to give you specific examples of things that other places are doing that somehow we can adapt is there are no such things. Here's why. Every time you try to hold up an example, say, some country has a system whereby electricity is based on prepaid cards, so people are always aware of how much electricity they're using, or some other place has, really great systems for encouraging dense habitation of multi-generational families. You can say all of these things, but in isolation, they're not technologies that anywhere else people can just adapt like that. Everything is connected to everything else. Every technology, whether it's a way of charging for electricity or a habitation pattern, these things are supported by larger cultures, by stories, by cultural norms, by policies, by generations of accumulated constitutions that ultimately inform how it is. It's sort of like, people look at the US and say, the US has the world's greatest military. Maybe we can just adopt that. And so some countries will actually try with the encouragement of the US. So they build their own military to model itself after the US with its obsession with air power and dependence on high-tech support. And then turns out that you can't support a military like that without everything else the US stands for. And so if you don't do that, that military, no matter how much it looks like the US one, will not survive. I won't mention it, but I think we all know what we're talking about here. But you cannot adopt pieces of technology in isolation because it depends on this entire other grander story behind it. So giving examples of things that somehow we can just take and incorporate is likely not to work because you're going to have to spin a story for how that would work, and those stories are not going to be true.
Great. Karen and Ken, this has been such a rich and fascinating conversation. Certainly going to be the highlight of my week, probably of my month, heck, probably my year, that I got to listen to you and to just be a part of this. So thank you so very much. Thanks also to Cooper Union for hosting this tonight and being a part of NYC Climate Week. And with that, I believe Anna has some final words for us.
No, wait, we want to thank you for being a marvelous moderator and guiding our conversation in a beautiful, light touch, and always listening and always pulling the threads together so well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. You make it look easy, but I know this is very hard. So thank you, Amy.
You both make the job easy. So thank you.
Well, and on behalf of the Cooper Climate Coalition, I'd like to, thank all of our speakers again. Thank you all so much for this wonderful conversation. And to anyone still watching, I just want to say that I hope you'll join us tomorrow for our conversation on structures of